Thank you, Barbara. Well, take no notice of that rather adulatory introduction. Very generous of her, but judge later. The evolution of botanical art in South Africa, from oxwagon to atelier, oxwagon to studio. Before we even get onto that particular topic, I think we actually need to know something about where botanical art came from in a Western context, because that is how it really began nearly 400 years ago with the arrival of the Dutch in Cape Town. And when we go back in history, it really all begins even earlier than that, 2,000 years ago with the ancient Greeks. What we have here is an image which I hope some of you can see. It's a page from a work by Dioscorides, who lived in about the year AD 50. It's called De Materia Medica in Latin, but of course, being Greek, his inscriptions are all in Greek, and the plant that he has illustrated in this fascinating document is the caraway seed plant. It's a page, probably one of 300 or 400 in this particular work, and this is where we see the beginnings of botanical art. Human beings found they had to illustrate plants, give them a name, and enumerate their properties. Plants were very useful medicinally. Greece was one of the first places in the world where medicinal plants were very seriously looked at and documented. And the two great commentators were Theophrastus and his near contemporary Dioscorides. This is from Dioscorides. It's a manuscript in the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York, just one page, of course. And what happened was these documents were copied again and again and again, and they were nearly always housed in monasteries or in the collections of wealthy noblemen. It was part of the Western mentality in terms of gathering information. The mathematicians in Greece were trying to understand numbers and angles. The astronomers were trying to understand the heavens. And the biologists, although they didn't use the word in those days, were trying to understand the natural world. And in doing so, they began to stimulate the need for good images of living organisms. Now, botanical art progressed from there into the Middle Ages, and this is a very crude series of images from a herbal printed in 1578. It's shortly after printing was devised by Gutenberg in the 1450s, and it was a method of making this knowledge available on a broader scale. So instead of laboriously hand-colored pictures, which were original artworks in their own right, these herbals were printed, and they were woodcuts of plants. Very crude, very basic, but the same philosophy, an illustration, a name, and an enumeration of its virtues, properties, and characteristics had to be there. And it's very much a part of the whole Western attitude to the new world that was emerging as they came out of the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, as they moved into the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment, and ultimately the scientific revolution. It was Europe's way of rationalizing and by analytical means the natural world around them. Botanical art isn't just flowers. It can be anything relating to plants. This is a very nice illustration of Surya vittata, which is a common Cape seaweed, done by Stanley Seagrief, who was professor of botany at Rhodes. He happened to be a very accomplished artist. So the lower orders, the mosses, the fungi, the lichens, they all come into botanical art. And as I said, botanical art need not be flowers. This is Anne Schweitzer, a beautiful drawing of Euphorbia grandicornis from this part of the world. No flowers at all, but celebrating the magnificence of its form and its texture. So there's a lot that falls into this category, botanical art, even roots and bulbs and tubers, and the more unexciting terrestrial parts are included. But I'm sure most of you, when you hear the word botanical art, think of something like that, That is one of Jacquin's plates of Scotia brachypetala, which is a low-felt tree, grown in Vienna in the late 1700s and illustrated by himself. And it shows the growing trend in botanical art to depict a plant in flower with dissections. This is another typical example of Western botanical art. This is from Comeline's Hortus Amsterdamensis, published in the late 1600s. It's a Cape species of Haemanthus, and it shows you the techniques used. Botanical art was essentially a method of illustration. It's generally always interpreted through the published work. And this 2-volume work is typical of the period, a copper engraving of a particular species, which was then hand-coloured. The original would have been separately preserved, and in many cases these originals survive. Here you see Erica vestita by Henry Andrews. It depicts that atomized structure, a plant in full bloom, floating in space against a bare white background with all its reproductive parts dissected out so that you could see them. So the illustrations were the key, and the originals were nearly always preserved in archives. Most people judged botanical art from published books, and those published books were often quite limited in number. But this is a copper engraving, which was the main method of reproduction. It wasn't entirely satisfactory, and you can see in this particular image, that's another copper engraving. And if we look closer, you can see the sharp lines of the engraver's engraving instrument, parallel lines. It was not really conducive to tonal nuances. But finally there emerged on the scene a remarkable man, Pierre-Joseph Redoute in France. This is Sparmannia africana. It's a very beautiful herb that grows in the Neisner area, and it's from one of his publications, and he used stipple engraving. If you look at that carefully, and I shall show you an enlargement in a minute, there are no hard lines, just thousands of small picked out dots to create the image. These were done on a copper plate, and if you look at that leaf, you'll see what I mean. There's wonderful tonal nuances. They were done on a copper plate. The copper plate was then inked. Each individual colour was individually inked with a little blob of rag on the end of a stick. It was referred to as à la poupée, with a rag doll, and the little rag was cleaned every time the colour had to be applied, and eventually when the copper plate was completely covered with the right colour, an impression was made, and the whole thing was cleaned with a solvent, and the whole process repeated. And that brought botanical art to a high point. And I think when you look at a few of Redoute's drawings like this, there's the base of that Nerina bulb, you'll see the softness of his texture, and it really is quite amazing. So that's actually the benchmark from which most human beings have judged botanical art. The great masters, Pierre-Joseph Redoute in France, the Bauer brothers, Franz and Ferdinand living in England, George Eret, a couple of his originals over there for you to look at, in the Netherlands. They formed the great alliance of the top-notch botanical artists. So, when the Dutch East India Company arrived in South Africa and established a refreshment station in Cape Town, do you think it was likely that there was going to be any great botanical art? Well, it was really a survival exercise first, but it was not long before some of their staff who had artistic talents were dragooned into creating images of the local flora. The Dutch East India Company is often perceived as a very aggressive commercial enterprise, which is perfectly true, but it had a softer side. It was also interested in gathering fundamental knowledge. The company was run by very educated men, and the Netherlands had some of the finest universities in Europe at the time. It also had a great tradition of flower growing, a great tradition of art, and most important, It was one of the most wealthy countries in Europe. They could pay for the best. And what happened was that very soon instructions went out to the company officials to start recording the useful and interesting and important plants at the Cape. Of course, before the Westerners arrived, there were a few rare examples of indigenous botanical art. This is a painting, a cave painting by the Sand people, presumably the Sand people. We really don't know who did it. And it shows aloes being gathered for either ritual or medicinal purposes, almost certainly medicinal purposes. And there's another image I'd like you to look at. That's the aloe image enlarged slightly. Another remarkable image that was only found about 15 years ago of a bulbous plant. This is one of the Amaryllidaceae, Buffoni distica, showing the bulb with its scales falling apart at the base, an umbel with individual flowers sticking out of it. Now, bear that image in mind because I shall return to that at the very end of this talk. So,